Want to know how to live skeptically and still have friends? So do I. Let's figure it out. Actually Speaking, a podcast that explores the human side of skepticism, critical thinking, and the skills we need to make it through the day. Hi everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Actually Speaking, a podcast that sets the science aside and explores the human side of skepticism. My name is Mike Meraz, and I'll be your host. Before jumping into a full episode topic, I thought it would be helpful to start things off with a brief introductory episode to introduce myself and the podcast, which takes a very different approach to the topic of skepticism. There might be some confusion, so I wanted to make sure that we're clear from the very start what the podcast is and what it is not. Now, Actually Speaking probably isn't like any other skepticism or science podcast you listen to. To start with, I'm doing the unthinkable and actually setting the science aside. Now, that probably raises quite a few eyebrows, but trust me, it's purely metaphorical, but necessary for the aspect of skepticism that we do want to talk about. And that's the human side of skepticism, or more specifically, the interpersonal and communication skills needed to effectively promote skepticism and critical thinking without wreaking havoc on your personal life. In other words, as I like to put it, how to live skeptically and still have friends. Let me share just a little about myself since it relates to how the podcast came about. I'm relatively new to the skeptical world. Like many of you, I've been a skeptic my whole life, but didn't realize it until recently, and certainly not soon enough to spare myself many years of frustration and strained relationships with family and friends. Professionally, I have a degree in geophysics, education, and counseling. I started out teaching high school physics, chemistry, and math, but eventually worked my way to more administrative roles in higher education. In the University of California system, I created support programs for students seeking advanced degrees in scientific fields. Now, these were programs that provided students with skills and training that they needed to survive the rigors of graduate research, obtain their doctoral degrees, get those PhDs, and then pursue leadership roles in their respective scientific fields. One of the things that our programs always emphasized was the importance of communication within science. In fact, we really didn't consider the students' education complete if all they learned were scientific facts and research methodology. A vital part of the scientific process is the ability to communicate scientific knowledge to others. And not just for the purpose of funding or a job interview, but to professionals in other fields, to students that they may teach, the general public, and especially those with non-science backgrounds such as family and friends. The programs and the students were both very successful and produced a lot of well-rounded scientists that were ready to tackle a variety of situations. Well, I'm sharing this because it's actually relevant to the skeptical community. I see a lot of similarities between these young scientists that we trained and the challenges that many skeptics are currently facing when interacting with family and friends. The skeptical movement obviously isn't an educational institution, but it is an educational community of people like yourself, intent on learning, thinking critically, and increasing scientific knowledge and understanding. And we see this happening in non-traditional ways. Through speakers, conferences, podcasts, magazines, television, internet, and all kinds of social media. This is a passionate community that's committed not only to educating themselves, but to sharing that information with others. And that's where things start to get challenging. What's happening within the skeptical community is that individuals are accumulating all this scientific information and then placing themselves in outreach situations where they're attempting to take that scientific knowledge and promote it, defend it, correct misinformation, encourage value, inspire passion and enthusiasm. These are all wonderful efforts. These are really good things. And let's face it, some people are just naturals at it. But I think for the majority of skeptics, including myself, we often find ourselves in outreach situations that might be a bit too challenging, that result in conflict, and anger, and frustration, and arguing, and our effectiveness is questionable. In fact, these situations can easily backfire and really serve no other purpose than to simply dig our opponents more firmly into their unfounded beliefs. Now, I think we're all familiar with these situations, and we know just how stressful they can be personally. Well, it may seem odd, but this is actually a good problem to have. What's happening is that the skeptical movement is growing. It's becoming more knowledgeable and increasing its level of activism and outreach. Unfortunately, As a movement, our training is lagging behind a bit and really needs to adapt to a more active and enabled community. It's not enough to simply share scientific information. We also need to share the specific skills on how to communicate it. As a community, we are excellent at distributing scientific facts within our ranks. But we're not so good at showing how best to then share that information with the general public or even within our own social circles. That skill-based information is there. It exists within the community. The expertise exists. The resources exist. But the mechanisms for distributing it isn't as well established as it is for, say, sending out the latest alert for a homeopathy scam or vaccination data or maybe just a really interesting skeptical interview. Sharing information is relatively easy to a receptive audience, but skill training, that's much harder, especially within a Skepticism 2.0 environment. Now, let me clarify that I'm not saying that the desire or intent for effective communication among skeptics doesn't exist. It does. You'll hear and read about it everywhere. Many articles, podcasts, books, interviews exist which clearly advocate for a greater level of communication and civility with non-skeptics. Just over the past few weeks alone, I've seen many calls for this. Here's what we're usually told. We need to be more careful in picking our battles, or maybe more selective in picking our battles. We need to present a more positive image of skepticism. We need to be both civil and critical at the same time, and somehow find that balance. We need to adapt to our audience. We need to adjust our message based on the situation, or that we simply need to set more realistic goals. Well, these are all excellent suggestions and really right on target for what we need to be doing. In fact, they just scratch the surface. But the part that is almost always missed is how. How do we know which battles to pick? Based on what criteria? How do we portray a positive image? What we see as positive isn't always viewed the same way by non-skeptics. How do we combine civility and criticism? There is a fear that civility itself is too passive and will simply allow misinformation to continue. How do we tell different audiences apart? How do we adapt to an audience? What exactly does that mean? What is it that we change? And how do we set realistic goals? As a community of skeptics, both beginners and veterans, we know very well what we should be doing, but we don't always know how to make that happen. That is where this podcast comes in. That is the contribution that I want to make to the skeptical community. I want to go one step further from what we should do and share with you some options for how to do it. How you can communicate more effectively to both strengthen your interpersonal skills and promote critical thinking. That's the contribution that I want to make with this podcast. Making skepticism palatable to the masses by focusing on the people and not just the science. Now, I'm new to the podcasting world, so actually speaking is definitely a work in progress and will certainly change over time. But the podcast does have two goals which are firmly set and fairly simple. The first is to live skeptically while maintaining healthy, positive, and constructive relationships with those that might not see the world in quite the same way. The second is to share our skepticism with others in a manner that promotes critical thinking instead of shutting it down. Everything we do will always come back to these two goals. And they might seem at odds with each other, but they're really not. In fact, when used together, they're a pretty powerful combination. So what's in store for us? What will we be talking about? Well, every other week, more frequently if possible, we'll be looking at various topics that cover both skills and how to apply them. For example, forming realistic expectations. We'll actually start off with this topic next time. You'd be surprised at how much more successful you can be when you're actually striving for the correct goal. We'll also take a look at harnessing the power of civility in promoting critical thinking. It's actually a very valuable tool. We'll also look at understanding the conditions needed for personal growth and how we can take those conditions and that knowledge and apply them to our interactions with people. We'll look at the spectrum of skepticism that exists within our community and why it's valuable. We're not all skeptical to the same degree, and it's good to understand that and know how to utilize that. We'll learn how to tell the difference between bad information and bad people. We don't always want to shoot the messenger. And we might even talk about some specific communication skills like escape routes and testimonials and how we can insert them into our conversations to help make us a lot more effective. We'll also tackle very practical topics, things that will give us some practice in actually taking some of the theory and ideas and skills that we have and putting them into use. Simple things like surviving the holidays and family gatherings. I know a lot of us have a hard time with that, myself included. Dealing with childhood fantasies, Santa Claus, tooth fairies, things like that. And based on some of the feedback that I've been getting from some of you who have contacted me early, one of the topics that's in great demand is parenting. Parenting. There's no shortage of requests for that. So we'll break that down and we'll see exactly what issues of parenting you might like to see addressed, and we'll talk about them. We'll also talk about learning to speak up and self-identify as a skeptic publicly. Different people have different levels of comfort in self-identifying either in public or just simply with family and friends. We'll talk about that and how to effectively do it. And if we're feeling particularly brave, we'll tackle the issue of skepticism and social media. I know a lot of you are out there on Facebook and Twitter and various forums, and sometimes you're out there getting into a lot of trouble. There's some tricks we can use to help navigate that a little more effectively. Okay, that's just a sample, and I'd be very interested to hear some of your ideas as to the topics you'd like to see discussed. We'll be covering a lot of ground, and it can be a bit overwhelming, but we'll take things one step at a time and try to hit areas of the greatest interest first. And along the way, we'll always identify and reinforce the specific skills needed. With a bit of practice, I think you'll find yourselves better equipped to understand and navigate the many challenges that skeptics face every day. And you just might find yourself breathing a bit easier in situations that previously stressed you out. Most days, I feel miserably at effective communication. In fact, I probably need a podcast like this more than most. But it's really not my intent to tell people what to do. I'm no expert, and I don't have all the answers. No one does. But I do have some related skills and experiences that you might find useful. I need to figure all this stuff out too for myself, and I'd like to share that process with you. So, do you want to know how to live skeptically and still have friends? Well, so do I. Let's figure it out together. If you have questions, comments, or would like to share your own tips and ideas on living skeptically, send them to actuallyspeaking@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at twitter.com/factually. Thanks for listening. Podcast you listen to. To start with, I'm doing the unthinkable and actually setting the science aside. Now that probably raises quite a few eyebrows, but trust me, it's purely metaphorical, but necessary for the aspect of skepticism that we do want to talk about. And that's the human side of skepticism, or more specifically, the interpersonal and communication skills needed to effectively promote skepticism and critical thinking without wreaking havoc on your personal life. In other words, as I like to put it, how to live skeptically and still have friends. Let me share just a... Hi everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Actually Speaking, a podcast that sets the science aside and explores the human side of skepticism. My name is Mike Meraz, and I'll be your host. Before jumping into a full episode topic, I thought it would be helpful to start things off with a brief introductory episode. Want to know how to live skeptically and still have friends? So do I. Let's figure it out. Actually Speaking, a podcast that explores the human side of skepticism, critical thinking, and the skills we need to make it through the day. Introduce myself and the podcast, which takes a very different approach to the topic of skepticism. There might be some confusion, so I wanted to make sure that we're clear from the very start what the podcast is and what it is not. Now, Actually Speaking probably isn't like any other skepticism or science